it controlled the government up until the early 1940s, and then it granted its colony independence. However, it did keep a base with a 99-year lease with an option, I guess an option to renew for another 99. And this base, when the time of the Cuban Revolution came and Fidel Castro came to power, the United States refused to give up this base, although they never really recognized Cuba's right to it. And I believe they send the money, a sum of money, to the Cuban government every year or every period of time to pay the rent for the space. And of course, the check has never been and never will be cashed by the current Cuban government. And so the United States has continued on. Cuba then turned off the water to Guantanamo, and then the United States government, the military and the government, paid for a desalination plant that was already built and existing near San Diego in California. And they had it taken apart and shipped across the country to Cuba and then reassembled so that they could take the salt water and transfer it into fresh water. And so the water, that desalination plant is still operating in Cuba. It was built around 1963. And that allows the U.S. to continue its occupation of Guantanamo, which is on Cuban territory, in violation of Cuban wishes and desires on the basis of the lease that was signed before the current Cuban government came to power. And the U.S. has used this base as a military base, basically. It was made famous in the famous movie with Jack Nicholson, Tom Cruise. You can't handle the truth. The truth, you can't handle the truth, right? That movie, it takes place in Guantanamo. And so Guantanamo, what it's used for, it was a political poke in the eye to the Castro regime, I think in part. It was used as a base to cover the entrances to the Caribbean that would be used by a hostile power potentially to enter the Caribbean, which there was never really that much of a chance of that happening. And then in this sort of like limbo, Guantanamo became a place offshore of the United States that detainees that were picked up in the war against terror, as it was called, and began after 9/11, this sort of an endless war that is continuing to this very day. And so detainees were brought to Guantanamo, and it was discovered that Guantanamo was just part of a huge network of camps that were built across the country. They were called black sites, and it turned out they were in countries such as Poland and other nations, a list of other nations. And these countries then had assisted the United States in taking in sort of secretly holding people who were picked up in Afghanistan and I guess later in Iraq and other places in the guise of this war on terrorism. So, a war on terror. So, Guantanamo filled up with fellows like the ones behind me. I think that's a photograph in Guantanamo. And it filled up with people who were taken and were not being afforded the same rights that past prisoners of war had been afforded in history. And there's something called there's the Geneva Convention, which are basically rules of war, rules of how to treat prisoners of war, in particular in civilian populations. And those were signed and developed not because anybody believes that war, modern-day war, where atom bombs have been dropped on cities, is any sort of moral endeavor or can be any way moralized by rules of law, but it was for self-interest, because if you are in a conflict with another country, you want your prisoners of war to be treated with the same respect as you treat their prisoners of war. And when we look at plenty of situations where prisoners of war are very, very poorly treated, you can see that that there might be some need in conflict to have some sort of rule of law, even in a brutal war, in order to have some ability to ensure the fact that your own citizens are well treated if they are kept as prisoners. But that was thrown to the wind in the War of Terror, And it turned out, and it came out later, that in fact they were torturing people in these camps, in the black ops sites offshore and in Guantanamo. And finally, it was ruled that although they were being held offshore, and that was the idea of keeping people offshore, because the belief was if they brought them to the United States, they would have to be given the same rights as an American once you're on American soil. Constitution, for the most part, guarantees you have the same rights as any American, so then you can have a lawyer, you have to have a trial, access to evidence, and the right to make an argument. Now, the attempt to have Guantanamo on these offshore sites was to eliminate any possibility or potential of having having these prisoners of war on American territory, on U.S. territory, and therefore that would release the people who were detaining these prisoners, and the CIA, which was in charge of this operation, to do what they called enhanced interrogation, which was the military euphemism for torturing people to try and get information out of them. Something that is very much illegal under the Geneva Convention. So the Geneva Conventions were thrown out the door. And eventually, interestingly enough, a judge did rule that although these people were being held, these prisoners were being held offshore, they actually were due certain basic rights. Basically, they had a right to a lawyer, they had a right to an impartial judge, and they had the right to some sort of hearing or fair hearing. And that's much less than the rights of a person who's accused in the United States. An accused person, American or somebody in the United States, has a presumption of innocence. There's no presumption of innocence. But for over 1,000 years, since the early days of England, we've had something called Habeas Corpus, which is produce the body, basically show us the body. And what that was an agreement between the nobility of England and the Crown of England back in the 1200s, when they signed a document to this effect, that a person who was held by the king you could demand that the king explain why they're holding this person. Basically, just explain why they're holding it. And then the king would make some statement why they were holding the person, and they would probably just continue holding them. But at least you could find out if your loved one or the person who has been taken by the king was alive or dead, and you could find out if they had any chance of ever getting out, right? And instead of just disappearing into the bowels of the dungeons of the British monarch. And this was in the United States, this was a major cause of the American Revolution. And we have in the first articles of the American Revolution a guarantee of the right of habeas corpus to all Americans. It's written right at the top in the first article of the American Constitution, U.S. Constitution, United States Constitution. And it's very clear that, and it's used all the time, and there has been attempts to whittle it away and to cut back on these rights, and they have been cut back. But basically, an American who's arrested and held in the bowels of a prison, if they don't charge them, they have to be released within a certain amount of time, 48, 24 hours. And if you do keep them, it's possible to have that person presented to a judge and the rationale for their being held presented to the judge. And this has been used in very positive ways throughout American history, although some people who have a problem with rights have felt that this gave criminals too much power to challenge the conditions of their incarceration. But still, it's a basic right in the United States. Habeas corpus, produce the body. It has been suspended. It was suspended by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. And many people were held as spies during the Civil War, and nobody knew where they were until the end of the war, unless they were traded away, which often happened in those days. Traded back and forth for prisoners on the other side, or sometimes even paroled to release. But towards the end of the war, it became more brutal, and prisoners were not allowed to be traded or to be released for the most part on both sides, and the prison camps became horrendous death traps where many, many people dying of disease, which gives you some idea what happens if you deny rights to prisoners of war, right? It could happen on both sides, all right? So what happened within the walls of Guantanamo and these black sites around the country? Well, in the case of one person, Abu Zayed, who was had some involvement with 9/11, planning it. He allegedly was involved in planning it. He'd never been put on trial, so we have to take people's word for it. And he was arrested around 2002 and brought to detention sites where he was waterboarded 83 times. And waterboarding is basically water torture. Pouring water in your face until you feel like you're going to drown, and then doing this repeatedly. He was thrown up against the wall, he was brutally beaten, and he lost an eye. The government claims the eye was already damaged. It's never really been fully, there's no outside medical intervention allowed, and the doctor who was brought in from Johns Hopkins to treat Abu Zayed was, we don't know who he is. His name is classified, so we can't ask him what the doctor thought of the condition when he first saw this person. But we know he lost his eye, he was brutally beaten, he's in his early 40s, and he's been held in Guantanamo since, and these other sites since 2002. Now, what's interesting is that the person who was in charge of his torture came out and it turned out in a report in the Washington Post, was Gina Haspel. And Gina Haspel is currently the newly, just as a few hours ago, was appointed by President Donald Trump as the new head of the Central Intelligence Agency. Gina Haspel is a 30-plus year veteran of the CIA. She's a career officer. It's claimed she's the first woman to be director, but it's my understanding that that is not necessarily true. There is another woman whose name is Avril, I can't think of her last name, and she was appointed deputy director under the Obama administration, and the person she replaced as deputy director had also been acting director. So technically, the Obama appointee is the first woman. It's interesting that Mr. Trump, who is renowned for his treatment of women and has been criticized, whether it's Stormy Daniels or the others, would try to make a big point of his appointing a woman to this job. But anyway, Gina Haspel, who's now the director, it turned out she remained nameless. The CIA asked the Washington Post not to mention her name, but it came out later, and it was known that she was the person in charge of the torture of Abu Zayed. She was the one who was in charge of the black site. She was the one who, it's believed, actually was present ordering the torture as it happened in the location where it was happening. These waterboardings and beatings and the loss of the eye and all these things happened under her watch, not only her direct watch, and that she actually gave the orders for it. She was in charge of the torture of this person and of others, right? So we have the first CIA director who's a known and open torturer of human beings, appointed by the president. And of course, she had to be moved to head the CIA today, suddenly, without warning, because the CIA position, director of CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, became opened because Mike Pompeo, who was the head of the CIA, was promoted to Secretary of State to replace Rex Tillerson, the oil company executive, who was fired by tweet sometime yesterday. I guess this morning was when Tillerson and the rest of the world all together found out that he had been fired by President Trump. Now, Pompeo is basically a neocon. He came in neoconservative, It's a political ideology, a warlike political ideology that's focused on basically supporting the idea of America first, which is the ideology that's presented by Donald Trump, which we all know doesn't mean like, let's all sing Kumbaya and hold hands as Americans while we sing the Star-Spangled Banner, but in fact, it means that the U.S. will engage in tariffs, eject its immigrants through mass deportations, spy and go after protesters, basically turn the country into a fascist regime. And so America First is sort of like the marketing. And if Donald Trump knows anything, it's how to market stuff. And so he marketed his plan as America First, but it's really down the line, a fascist regime, or an attempt to impose a fascist regime. Tillerson, a rock-ribbed Republican in the mold of Condoleezza Rice, who actually suggested him for the job. The former, under the Bush administration, had been Condoleezza Rice, who was the Secretary of State. Hardcore Republican international politics that we've gotten to know all so well under the Bush administration, both Bushes, and previous that, the Reagan administration. Warlike, but at the same time openly negotiating warfare on one end, like sort of a two-track policy of open negotiation as if you're looking for peace on one hand, while on the other hand, building the war machine up to new heights. And sort of this two-track policy was both Democrats and Republicans followed it. Most Republicans sort of established it under Reagan administration of like a two-track policy, sort of a good cop, bad cop, Mutt and Jeff routine in international politics. But Trump is just getting rid of the good guy part of it. Imagine like there's a good guy, bad guy cop routine, and then they just tell the good guy cop to get out, and there's two bad guys there in the room, right? And so, that's going to be the Trump style, is just sort of bludgeon other countries into following whatever the U.S. wants them to do or attempting to do that. And so Mike Pompeo sort of represents this neocon philosophy, and at the heart of the neocon philosophy, if there's anything that's really at the heart of it, is that Islam, the U.S., the Christian, Judeo-Christian America and West is in a life and death battle with Islam for the cultural, future of the West. And as such, they don't see Muslim people as I think most decent people do, as people like everybody else with, the same great variety of views and points of view that any group would have, as you can have Christian evangelical right-wingers like Mike Pompeo, who wants to go to war against, to tear up the agreement with Iran and confront even, actually what's funny is sort of this double, with allowing Russia to get away with a lot of things on one hand, while on the other hand, ratcheting up the confrontation with Russia. So, it's exactly what's going on with these folks is hard to tell, but they seem to be focused mostly on Iran and somehow countering the power of Iran in regards to both Saudi Arabia and Israel, and maybe heading us and pushing us in a direction with some sort of conflict or war with Iran. Is a neocon philosophy, and it's the modern-day neocon philosophy. A heavy-duty, high-pressure attack on Muslim countries for the purpose of establishing this America First regime. And Mike Pompeo is famous for that. He was a Tea Party Republican, came to power in Kansas, and he's evangelical Christian, extreme conservative, Catholic background. And he is a person who's found close association. He's gotten along with Donald Trump better than all these other folks. And he's therefore stayed working in the White House, even as so many of his compatriots have been eliminated, and so many positions within the State Department and the government remain empty, which tells me that they want to streamline the decision making. Now, that could be, it's frightening to me what that could mean and what we're building towards now. Are we building towards conflict, more a restoration, which it never, you know, I'm not going to let the Obama administration off on this. The Obama administration had promised to close Guantanamo. There's no reason why people who can be charged with a crime can't be moved to New York or other jurisdictions to be put on trial. They're very experienced in the Southern District here in Manhattan in dealing with these kind of terrorism trials, and they have had a 1,000 batting percentage. You know, they've been batting 1,000 and putting these people away. I haven't heard of anybody not being put away. The problem is, I guess, when you put people in a prison in the United States where there's some access to them, you can't torture them, right? And that's the only thing you would, you know, gain by holding them offshore and denying these people any sort of rights, is that they could be tortured. Now, you know, some would say, well, if they could give us information that could stop another attack, isn't worth the torture. Ridiculous. Number one, it diminishes the nation that engages in it, all right? It diminishes it before history. How our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren explain what happened. And if you don't believe me, ask a young German person how they deal with the embarrassment and the horror of what, you know, they have to explain why their great-grandparents did this and grandparents did this kind of thing. All right, so we want to be in that position for our children, right? Leave them something better, you know, than that. That's you know, some people say, but that's not. What about this? There could be plenty of war. They have not gotten any actionable intelligence from torture. Everybody knows torture doesn't get actionable intelligence. What they got from people was stories about things that happened. Abu Zayd was totally capitulated and gave much information without any torture at all. The torture was just done for revenge. It was done out of vindictive, hateful revenge. And the problem with that, and the reason that they passed the Geneva Conventions to prevent that from happening, to the extent it's preventable, is that it becomes a tit-for-tat battle. All right? And is that the kind of world we want to live in? All right? That we just torture people, and then so many of the people, there's so many cases of innocent people, without any sort of being able to see the evidence, with the secret evidence that they use, classified evidence that is kept secret from people. They have no idea what's being used against them, and you have people who wrote a joke that annoyed a powerful person in a country, who then went and called these people terrorists, had them arrested, sent to Guantanamo, and it's years later they're tortured, kept away from their families, and it's discovered that they were just innocent. How can we find out if people are innocent if we don't test the evidence against them in a court of law? That's what it's for. This, what we're doing here, what's behind me on the screen, is demeaning to not just the people this is happening to, but it's demeaning to us. And if we think that we can just win every war and every battle by ratcheting up the violence because we're bigger than everybody and we can step aside and take care of everybody, well, look around at the world. Is that working? Has that brought peace? If the war against terror has been so successful, if these tactics have been so successful, why are we still fighting it 17 years later with no end in sight? In fact, under this new government, we're looking at expansion of this war. And we're looking more and more at a hot war, a potential hot war happening because of this. You know, it doesn't take much. The president is going to go off to North Korea without any support. What does Donald Trump know about North Korea, about any place outside of, you know, Stormy Daniels' inner sanctum? What does he know about any of this? Does he think that Kim Jong-un is gonna make mincemeat of him? But he's the greatest negotiator in the world, right? And who does he have to back him up? Nobody with any experience. Even Tillerson had no experience in any of this. And a vindictive, warlike attitude and an insulting demeanor. And he's going to now try and browbeat people into peace, into giving up their nukes, and not thinking they're going to be building and doubling down and building twice as many with a guy like him in charge. You know, you want peace? Then you have to fight for peace. You want war? You leave things going the way they're going right now, you know, and the blood will roll in the streets. We have to do something. We have to be out in the streets and deal with this. Thank you. I'll see you next week. This has been Let 'Em Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo.